Our third and most common type of jet engine is the turbofan. There are two main types of turbofan, but right now I'm going over the general turbofan. So a turbofan is essentially a turbojet that has a large fan attached at the front before the engine itself, and that sucks in more air. So this allows it to operate at a higher temperature because you've got additional air. And also, due to the additional air, some of it gets routed around the combustion chamber, and that actually cools the outer skin and some of the components of the engine. This means that you can have the higher combustion temperature and not have a flaming molten piece of metal after a couple minutes. So, good example here. This is a C-17. It is equipped with turbofan engines, high bypass turbofan engines. The fan at the front has a much larger diameter than the end of the turbojet, which is about there. And this duct that we can see here is the venting that the bypass air goes through, so that keeps the rest of the engine cool. So that's the general premises of a high bypass. So high bypass, they are very fuel efficient. They produce lots of thrust, but they are awful for high speed. They're very good for low speed operations. So somewhere between the 300 to high 500s. Which is what most civilian airliners fly at. So they're the perfect speed, perfect engine for that speed. And then here we have the A10. Again, similar design. It is a bypass turbofan engine. It's not quite. It doesn't have quite a high bypass as the C-17 because it is a combat aircraft. So we'll go to the back. And you might notice, yes, there's that bypass again. So yes, these engines can operate at higher temperatures, but due to that higher ingested air, they don't need to burn as much fuel because a lot of thrust actually comes from the bypassed air. Modern jet engines, turbofan engines, up to 70% of their thrust can come up just from the bypassed air. That fan that sucks in the air produces a good portion of thrust. And then we get to low bypass turbofan engines. So these are a little bit more different. They do have a bypass. However, you might notice, if we go to the end, there is no duct to allow the unburned air out, because essentially it does, if the afterburner is on, it does get burned again. The bypassed air travels inside the engine itself is a little smaller than this mounting, this cowling, so the bypassed air can go around it, and again that cools everything down. But in this case, the low bypass operates at a much higher pressure. So you've got vastly more air in there. You've also operated at a much higher temperature. So this is essentially a turbojet on steroids. You're having a lot more air being forced into the engine, and you can run at a higher temperature, as mentioned with the high bypass, because you can cool down your engine components. So that's the basic synopsis of high bypass and low bypass turbofan engines. One more thing to mention. So modern day high bypass turbofan engines, they are much quieter than other traditional jet engines, minus the turboprop. They are still quite loud, but not quite to that same extent as a turbojet or a low bypass turbofan. So another thing we'll really quickly take a look at is the back of this aircraft. So again, this is also a low bypass turbofan. So that this is quick, quick look through that. Okay. And then our last and final section is going to be on the afterburner, and I'll be back in a minute.